This is the historically accurate story about 3 airmen in the 100th Bombardment Group during World War II: Gale Cleven, John Egan, and Rosie Rosenthal. All 3 were American airmen who would fly in B-17 bombers during the air war in Europe. They were tasked with blasting apart the German war machine. The vast majority of the information in this video comes right from the book Masters of the Air. The story of these 3 is actually only a fraction of the book, but I have a strong suspicion the stories of these 3 will be the bulk of the material covered in the upcoming Apple TV series. I'll be telling an overview of their stories. That way, you can know what ends up being factual in the series and what is not. The book covers so much more than just what the Apple TV series will likely cover. So if you want dozens of stories and a highly detailed overview of the strategy, timeline, and technology of the air war, I definitely recommend picking it up. Also, please make sure to check out the description of this video for more detailed sources of videos or images I have included. Cleven, Egan, and Rosenthal were all part of the 100th Bombardment Group serving under the 8th Air Force, a combat force formed in 1942. The bombardment group the 3 served under would eventually be nicknamed the Bloody 100th, due to the massive casualty rate it sustained during the war. 2/3 of the airmen in the 8th would either be killed in action or captured by the Germans. Their motto was, "At least we're not in a German U-boat." That's actually not true, that wasn't their motto. Anyways, the bomb group itself was composed of squadrons, smaller groupings of planes. Cleven, Egan, and Rosenthal would all be part of and eventually lead squadrons stationed at Thorpe Abbotts, a village northeast of London. From there, they would fly in formation up to 20,000 feet in the air, in temperatures 40 below zero, and cross over into mainland Europe towards their target. Once they reached their destination, which were generally German-occupied industrial centers, airfields, and ports, the bombers would release a payload of bombs stored in the bottom of their plane and then return to Allied territory. This was a new form of aerial warfare, called precision bombing, and it was designed to help win the war faster and more decisively. Kind of like how you break the will of your kid brother by destroying all of his train sets, so that you can win Christmas. That's how Christmas works, right? The beginning, 1940. Gale Cleven was born and raised in Wyoming. Right before the war, he had worked as a roughneck on a drilling crew while he attended college. Ew! Can't get much more American than that! At age 21 in 1940, he enlisted and would eventually become a major at the beginning of 1943 and a squadron commander at age 24. The book describes him as a tough guy. He would literally walk around the base with a toothpick in his mouth and his hat cocked on his head. Cleven was idolized by many of the other airmen. His nickname was Buck, given to him by his friend John Egan. And there is no question that Hollywood has pretty boy washed him. That aside, I appreciate that at least the casting of the airmen makes them look way more believably in their early 20s than a certain other series. John Egan, too, was put on a pedestal by his comrades. In fact, even Cleven himself admitted to looking up to Egan. John Egan basically looked like a metropolitan hipster from 2014. If you look like that now, you'd get beat up. But at the time, all the other airmen also thought he was cool. The book says he was often seen wearing the same fleece-lined flying jacket. John Egan would end up being promoted to major the same month as Gale Cleven, at the start of 1943. He was 27 by the time he started flying missions, which was an age considered ancient compared to the rest of the airmen in the 100th. According to the book, during the war, he took the time to handwrite letters to the mothers and wives of airmen who died during the war. Training, 1942. At the beginning of the war, training for a pilot typically lasted around 9 months in the United States. The men selected to become pilots were often chosen due to their superior skill, psychological stability, and coordination. You know, because generally you don't want people who are in charge of a giant machine carrying a bunch of other people with a ton of bombs stored in the bottom to be clumsy and mentally unstable. Around half who went through the necessary tests were denied. The airmen that served as part of the bomber crews also had personalities distinct from fighter pilots. They were typically patient, intelligent, and team players. Attributes necessary in the collaborative, high-stakes, high-stress environment of a B-17 flying into Germany. The airmen had to absorb a litany of skills related to navigation, plane mechanics, Morse code, and various other proficiencies. Before being deployed, the 100th simulated future missions in their aircraft by precision bombing sand targets in the western United States. Imagine living near there. I bet you were hoping the process for selecting bombardiers was rigorous. In May 1943, Gale Cleven piloted a B-17 leading a squadron from Nebraska to Maine and then from Maine to England. Many other airmen made it by train to New Jersey and then spent over a week on a voyage across the Atlantic. By early June, they had arrived in Thorpe Abbotts, the main hub of the 100th for the remainder of the war in Europe. Local British pubs were often frequented by members of the 82nd, and considering they were living in concrete huts and getting shot at in what was basically a giant tin can with guns attached, it made sense they spent a lot of their free time drinking. That summer, the airmen would experience the fiery chaos of the cold, open air of Europe. Danger, 1943. The 100th Bombardment Group would enter the hostile skies of Europe in June 1943. Initially, the 100th would be tasked with dropping their bombs during the daylight hours, in conditions that would make them highly visible to the Germans. And in the summer of 1943, the bombers were left vulnerable, often without any escort fighters to keep them safe from enemy planes. This was because it wasn't until later into the war that the range limitations of American planes like the P-47 Thunderbolts were improved to a degree to which they would be able to travel deeper into Germany. During this time, the airmen would often be without protection in the clear daylight skies, with only other B-17 crew members to turn to. In those initial summer months, the 100th would be battered by withering flak and onslaughts from the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The Bloody 100th would suffer immense losses as a result of these dangers. A chance of being shot down wasn't the only hazard the airmen had to worry about. They were flying at high altitudes in unpressurized bombers in punishing physical conditions. The temperature inside the planes was often frigid, with sub-zero temperatures common at altitudes of 20,000 feet or more. Meanwhile, one of you from the Midwest watching is like, "Oh, that ain't even that cold where I live." To stay warm, the airmen had to layer up in thick flying gear made out of heavy wool or sheepskin. This was even accompanied with a heated flying suit. But since the contraption was prone to short-circuiting, the suit would sometimes lead to a painful electrocution of the airmen, sometimes becoming more trouble than it was worth. The planes were also incredibly loud, making it necessary for the people inside to use intercoms to communicate. You know, the US military just has a knack for finding new ways to traumatize 20-year-olds. At high altitudes, the air was too thin to breathe in without supplemental oxygen, and one piece of equipment malfunctioning could mean certain death. A mask ajar or a faulty regulator could lead to a gradual loss of oxygen, causing a person to become disoriented, pass out, or even asphyxiate. Frostbite was also a constant risk, as the airmen were exposed to the extreme cold for extended periods of time. And no, there were not flight attendants to give out complimentary pretzels. And what was the protocol if the plane was doomed to explode or fall out of the sky? Well, jump out of it, of course. In an air battle, if the plane ended up damaged too badly and was on fire or falling out of the sky, the airmen would be tasked with bailing out of the plane through a narrow escape hatch and deploying their parachutes after jumping out, hoping to land in Allied territory or at least on land at all. With conditions this unpredictable and harrowing, mental breakdowns and debilitating nightmares after missions would periodically occur among a minority of the airmen. During the war, several models of bombers would be used by the 8th Air Force. These included the B-17 Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and the B-29 Super Fortress. However, the B-29 did not come into use until the very end of the war in the Pacific. Despite many bombardment groups in the 8th Air Force flying B-24 Liberators, Gale Cleven, John Egan, and Rosie Rosenthal all flew their missions in B-17 Fortresses. A B-17 would usually have a crew of 10 people, a pilot in the cockpit tasked with flying the plane itself, a co-pilot who assisted with navigation and communication, a navigator located behind the cockpit responsible for orientating the plane's position, a bombardier just behind the navigator whose job was to aim and release the bombs, a radio operator in the radio room behind the cockpit who was tasked with communicating between the crew, other aircraft, and ground stations, a top turret gunner controlling the turret at the top of the plane responsible for defense against enemy aircraft, a ball turret gunner positioned in a spherical turret under the plane to defend the B-17 from below, waist gunners who were located at both sides of the plane behind the wings, providing defense on the sides of the aircraft. And finally, the tail gunner, at the end of the plane in the tail, responsible for defense from behind. Got all that? Because there will be a quiz at the end, and it will not be multiple choice. By mid-August 1943, the 100th had flown a bit over 20 missions into Axis-occupied Europe and suffered heavy losses. But things were about to become even more perilous for Gale Cleven and John Egan. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission, August 17th, 1943. Gale Cleven and John Egan were shaken awake at 1:30 in the morning. #grindset. Productivity YouTubers shaking in their boots. They were now preparing to be sent out on a mission to bomb aircraft in engine assembly shops in Regensburg, Germany. A separate group of bombers were to be sent to a bombing mission at Schweinfurt. Cleven, Egan, and their comrades would be sent out to destroy 30% of Germany's single-engine fighter plane production. When bombers flew in formation, there were sometimes positions in the formation that were more desirable than others. Gale Cleven was luckily in a very safe and protected position in the formation. Just kidding, he was in the lowest and most vulnerable position. Overall, the Hundredth was to be in a particularly low and vulnerable position in the plane formation. The mission meant that the bombers would be flying deep into Germany, and they would be flying without fighter escorts past a certain distance. And instead of turning around after the objective to fly back to England, they would be tasked with flying all the way to North Africa to land, flying past the Austrian Alps and through Italy. And while over Italy, they would be tasked with bombing Mario and Luigi's house. Just kidding. Not that part. Once in the air and into hostile territory, and shortly after the Thunderbolt escort came to the limit of their range and had to turn back, the vulnerable airmen were ambushed by a horde of enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe was firing at the bombers in greater numbers than ever before. It wasn't long until 6 B-17s, collectively containing dozens of airmen, had been shot out of the sky. As the Luftwaffe attacked, John Egan was firing a .50 caliber machine gun at the enemy fighters from the nose of his plane, and he was firing so relentlessly that the shells literally began to pile up to his knees. Egan and his crew were fighting for their lives as the battle raged on for nearly 30 minutes. The book's description of the battle really puts into perspective how insane it must have been. They witnessed a nasty display of mechanical and human carnage literally flying through the air around them. Peering outside their B-17, they saw chunks of other planes that had been broken apart, explosions, gear from other airmen, and human body parts whipped through the air. Meanwhile, Cleven's B-17 had been badly beaten by 20mm cannon shells. Cleven's radio operator had been hit. His legs shot off, he had fallen to the ground, was bleeding out, and had thrown up onto himself. And while there, the book describes that his vomit was freezing around his dying body in the sub-zero temperatures. He did not make it back to his family. The nose of the plane had been blasted through, and the B-17's engine was now in flames. In response to the state of the plane and the crew, Gale Cleven's pilot had started begging Cleven for the crew to bail out of the plane. Heard over the plane's intercom, Cleven said back to the pilot, quote, "You son of a bitch, you sit there and take it." I mean, if that doesn't make it into the show, what the heck? And as the book states, Cleven's words had restored confidence in his crew. By now, an hour and a half had passed since the first strike by the Luftwaffe, and the B-17s were finally at their target. Cleven, Egan, and the other bombers in the formation successfully released their bombs and hit the target. But on that day, the 100th had lost dozens of young lives. Despite their losses, the mission was successful. After their bombs had been released to tear apart the industrial area below, the 100th then began making their way through the Alps, past Italy, and safely landed in the Algerian desert. After that day, Gale Cleven was recommended for the Medal of Honor. Cleven never received it. In his own words, quote, "I didn't get it and I didn't deserve it." He did, however, earn the Distinguished Service Cross, but never went to collect it. Cleven recalled, quote, "Medal, hell, I needed an aspirin, so I remain undecorated." John Egan had an amusing theory of how he made it out alive. Quote, "I carried 2 rosaries, 2 good luck medals, and a $2 bill, off of which I had chewed a corner for each of my missions. I also wore my sweater backwards and my good luck jacket." Rosie Rosenthal arrives, September 1943. After the losses the 100th had suffered during the Regensburg mission, Robert Rosie Rosenthal was brought into the 100th as one of the replacements. He was a 26-year-old Jewish man from New York. Rosie recalls his purpose for flying was to stop Hitler, not only because he was Jewish, but because he felt Hitler was a threat to the entire world. He was shy, but was always committed to the cause. Quote, "Everything I've done or hope to do is strictly because I hate persecution. A human being has to look out for other human beings, or else there's no civilization." And despite not being one of the original airmen in the 100th, he gained the respect of John Egan quickly. During a practice flight, his maneuvering was so impressive, Egan wanted to make Rosie his wingman. The Bremen Mission, October 8, 1943. Months after the carnage of the Regensburg mission, on October 8, 1943, Buck Cleven was headed out on another bombing mission with its target located in Bremen, Germany. On that same day, John Egan had just begun his first leave in London. Unfortunately for the 100th on that day, Bremen was heavily defended by the Germans. The mission began to go wrong shortly after Gale Cleven's plane had released the bombs. 3 Luftwaffe fighters sped towards his fortress, unleashing a storm of bullets onto the plane. In a flash, the Germans had successfully struck Cleven's plane. They disabled 3 engines, punctured the tail and the nose, removed a portion of the left wing, and ignited the cockpit. The B-17s began to break formation. With a catastrophic fire roaring violently in his plane, Cleven had no choice but to command his crew to evacuate. At this point, with the plane a measly 2,000 feet from the ground, Cleven was the final person to jump from the aircraft. After swiftly deploying his parachute, Cleven was on a rapid collision course towards a farmhouse below. Falling quickly and with little time to act, he swung his chute in an attempt to avoid slamming into the building. Unfortunately, he spun out of control, his body shooting directly through the back doorway of the home's kitchen, his body smashing into the furniture. At that moment, a German woman and her daughter began to yell. The woman's husband grabbed a pitchfork and rushed to point it up against Cleven. Quote, "In my pitiful high school German, I tried to convince him I was the good guy. He wasn't buying it." Hours later, when Cleven's plane didn't return to England, his comrades were dumbfounded. Cleven, an icon of the 100th, was gone. Still in London the next day, John Egan read about the losses the 100th suffered at Bremen in the newspaper. He immediately phoned the base. He then received the bad news about Cleven. His friend had not returned. The Munster Mission, October 10th, 1943. Soon after Cleven's plane went down over Germany, John Egan was receiving a briefing. A residential area in Munster was to be the target this time, and despite the mission likely leading to many civilian deaths, Egan says that he was hyped out of his mind. Egan recalled that he cheered and believed it to be, quote, "a dream to avenge a buddy." It was October 10th, 1943, on a hazy English morning. 53 bombers were set out to bomb Munster. John Egan, acting as co-pilot, was climbing into one of them, but this time without his lucky flying jacket. Rosie Rosenthal was also headed to Munster in another flying fortress, in the position of pilot. The 100th's B-17s would be accompanied by Thunderbolts, the American fighter planes, now able to travel with the bombers deeper into Germany than ever before. Problems for the 100th began early. Shortly after takeoff, several bombers had to turn back due to technical mishaps, and before even making it into Germany, the German radar had seen the attack coming. Upon reaching the Dutch border, the ambush on the Americans began. Suddenly, the 100th was being bombarded by relentless fire from a flak gun. In an instant, one of Egan's waist gunners had been hit, and his life snuffed out. The Thunderbolts had reached the end of their range and had to turn back, leaving the bombers even more vulnerable. Seizing the opportunity, a swarm of a couple hundred Luftwaffe fighters had begun their onslaught on the Americans. Almost immediately, John Egan's plane was hit. An explosion erupted underneath his aircraft. The plane was sent into a dive, a plume of dark smoke pouring into the sky above it. Egan took quick action to command his comrades to abandon ship. The second after he had begun to speak into the intercom, an inferno erupted in the aircraft. At that moment, Egan switched the plane into autopilot. The fire still roaring, Egan began arguing with his pilot over who should jump from the plane first. John Egan recalls, at that moment, bullet holes appeared right beside his feet. Ending the argument, Egan said to his pilot, quote, "I'll see you, Brady," and then jumped from the burning aircraft, deploying his parachute shortly afterwards. As he sank towards the ground, Luftwaffe fighter planes began to fire right at him, filling his chute with holes. Despite that, he luckily made it to the ground in one piece. Once on solid ground, Egan began to tear off his heavy flying gear, swiftly separating himself from his chute right after he saw several German soldiers on the ground rushing towards him. Once freed from his heavy flying gear, John Egan made a beeline for the nearby woods. It's worth asking yourself if you're able to run across an open field faster than 2 dudes who want to kill you. Hashtag workout motivation. Still in the air, Rosie and his crew were fiercely fighting one of the most brutal air battles of the war. The book states that the ensuing 45 minutes of human carnage was considered to be one of the largest and most aggressive strikes of Nazi air power on American bombers. Wave after wave of Luftwaffe fighters charged on the 100th. The American B-17s were shot down everywhere, exploding into infernos, falling out of the sky, breaking apart into pieces, the sky filled with parachutes from bailing flyers. The airmen spotted friends that didn't have time to equip their chutes before jumping out of their planes. They flipped down helplessly through the air to their death. A few of the 100th planes, including Rosie's, had evaded the gore and destruction and managed to make their way to the target and released their bombs. By this time in the battle, 3 of Rosie's crewmates had been hit, but the onslaught was not over. Shortly after dropping the bombs, German fighters fired on Rosie's B-17 again. Despite the circumstances, Rosie recalled feeling fearful and energized, but not panicked. Under the pressured pursuit of the Germans, Rosie began executing every kind of maneuver and evasive action he could. At one point, Rosie steered the plane into a dive so rapidly, his co-pilot became deprived of oxygen and fell unconscious next to him. Against all odds, Rosie and his plane had escaped the German onslaught and evaded a grisly death in the sky. But the danger was not over yet. The plane had been badly damaged, and upon reaching Thorpe Abbott's England, Rosie had no other choice but to crash land his plane. Despite the risk, Rosie had managed to land safely. He had made it back alive to the ground and was standing outside his B-17. At that moment, looking towards the man next to him, he remembered asking, quote, "Are they all this tough?" Rosie recalls, quote, "People talk about courage, but that's a bunch of baloney. I wasn't courageous on the Munster mission. I had a job to do, to deliver those bombs, and I did it. After that, my only concern was the 9 other men in my plane. How could I get them home?" In less than a 15-minute span of time in the air, 12 of 13 of the planes in the formation were lost. The bombardment group had lost more than 200 people in just the last week. And they had lost Cleven and Egan, 2 beloved squadron leaders. Rosie's plane was the only one from his formation to return. Rosie recalled that after the Munster mission, he felt weighed down with guilt that he had survived, while others had not. Interrogation, October 1943. After parachuting into a German farmhouse after his plane went down during the Bremen mission, Gale Cleven was now a prisoner of war. When captured, he was given hot tea and schnitzel by the Germans. No, he wasn't. He was thrown into a cold, flea-infested cell. World War II, Germans, keep up. John Egan, having jumped from his aircraft during the Munster mission, had managed to evade the Germans for several days before he was eventually captured as well. He too was held in solitary confinement in the exact same building. Neither of the friends had any idea the other was also there. The building where they were held was called De Log Luft, a Luftwaffe interrogation center. For over a week, in between the uncomfortable solitude, Cleven and Egan underwent separate and repeated interrogations. After almost a dozen days spent in a cramped cell, experiencing constant interrogation, Gale Cleven was to be relocated to a prisoner camp called Stalag Luft 3, located close to a town named Sagen. This camp was located deep into Nazi territory in a region which today is now part of Poland. Cleven, along with other airmen, were cramped into boxcars which reeked of manure that had previously been used to transport livestock. Their transport took 3 days across hundreds of miles. Cleven arrived at Stalag Luft 3 on October 23rd, finally reunited with many of his comrades from the 100th who had also been captured and relocated there. 3 days later, Gale Cleven witnessed John Egan's arrival. When he saw his friend enter the camp, he shouted out to him, quote, "What took you so long?" In response, Egan yelled back to him, quote, "Well, that's what you get for being sentimental. Get yourself a friend who is still willing to crack jokes even when you're both captured by Nazis." It would be another 4 months from that moment until the two would finally be properly reunited in the same compound of the camp. Rosie the Unstoppable, March to May 1944. Despite the heartfelt loss of Gale Cleven and John Egan, the 100th was still flying missions to bomb apart the German war machine. In March 1944, Rosie had just completed a mission to Berlin. After returning to Thorpe Abbott's, Rosie had finally crossed out the compulsory 25 missions demanded of him before he was no longer required to fly. But that night, after celebrating, Rosie was still determined to keep flying. Quote, "I had to do what I could for as long as I was able." Having lost their commander Gale Cleven back in October 1943, the 350th Bomb Squadron's morale and organization had depressed. That month, Rosie Rosenthal took over command of the squadron. When Rosie took over the position, he recalled telling his airmen that they had a duty to win the war, and more importantly, they had a duty to work together as they all relied on each other to survive. Rosie's speech had succeeded in reinvigorating the squadron. In the words of a fellow 100th member, Harry Crosby, quote, "Gale Cleven and John Egan gave the 100th its personality. Bob Rosenthal helped us want to win the war." Kind of type A, but all right. I have to say, this book really made these three seem like action heroes. No wonder Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg were drawn to their stories. In May, the casualty rates of the 100th began to decline. By this point, the Luftwaffe had been severely beaten down by the USAAF and R.A.F. fighters. The 100th had reached a turning point. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Bombers lined up in the skies above the fleet of ships carrying American troops headed for the beaches of Normandy, and one of those planes was Rosie Rosenthal. On that day, German aerial resistance was made up of a measly 250 planes. Rosie recalled the reaction of his crews before the invasion. Quote, "I had never seen such a reaction from them. They stood and cheered and roared. This is the day they had been looking towards. I led a group on the third bombing mission of D-Day, towards dusk. We had a rule. No one could talk on the intercom unless it was absolutely necessary. Radio discipline. But as we passed over that vast armada and headed over the beaches, a member of our crew started to say a prayer for the people down below, and we all joined in. It was one of the most emotional moments of my life." In the following months, the 100th would shift to providing air support of ground troops throughout the Allied front in France. On July 25th, the 3rd Air Division, led by Rosie Rosenthal, would be aiding Americans on the ground by bombing an area occupied by German troops near St. Lô. Visibility was obscured by cloudy weather conditions and dust and debris that had been kicked up by strafing Thunderbolts that had already fired on the German line. As a result, Rosenthal's plane ended up dropping their bombs late, and many other planes around him dropped short. As a consequence, some of the bombs fell off target onto unsuspecting American troops. Over 100 American troops had been killed and several hundred more wounded, but the German line was also hit, badly. The bombs killed thousands of troops, leaving an apocalyptic landscape in their wake. The St. Lô breakout was achieved. Sagen, 1944. At the prisoner camp Stalag Luft 3 near the town of Sagen, members of the 100th had developed a system of military hierarchy to organize various tasks among them, such as monitoring guards, planning escapes, sorting resources, along with finding creative ways to cause trouble for their German guards. Both Gale Cleven and John Egan worked at the top of this hierarchy, along with their first commander. In the camp, the Americans were fed a single meal a day, barley soup with bugs. They were also doled out uncooked rations, usually containing potatoes infested with worms, sawdust-infused black bread, and blood sausage. But every week, the Red Cross delivered parcels of more substantial food to the POWs. Items like canned fish, crackers, dried fruit, chocolate, and many other supplementary items that helped provide more nutrition and stave off starvation. Vegetables were sparsely given to the Americans, leading airmen to create little gardens behind buildings to help make their diet more robust. The imprisoned members of the 100th were competently working together despite the circumstances. Shot down, September 10th, 1944. In early September, Rosie Rosenthal was in the process of conducting a bombing mission over Nuremberg when his plane was badly damaged by a flak gun. With no other viable option, Rosie then had to crash land his B-17 down into France. He managed to land his plane on the ground, but in the process, he broke his nose and one of his arms and passed out in the cockpit. Luckily, he was rescued and flown to recover in a hospital in Britain. Only several weeks later after the incident, Rosie insisted to be allowed to take command of his squadron once more and fly again. He was promoted to major and his wish was granted. The March, January 27th, 1945. After receiving news in December 1944 of the German offensive, the morale of the Americans took a turn for the worse. Not even especially large bugs in the Americans' gruel could probably make up for that news. Access to rations became more scarce, and the airmen huddled in their beds to try to stave off the bitter cold. In order to keep their spirits up, some prisoners in the Stalag did manage to create handmade Christmas decorations, scrapped together with cellophane from cigarette packages sent by the Red Cross and scraps of paper. Despite the gains made by the Germans on the Western Front, less than 100 miles away from Sagen, the Russian army was fighting through German territory. Under direct orders from Hitler, the Luftwaffe was ordered to relocate the imprisoned airmen of Stalag Luft 3 closer to Berlin. On January 27th, Gale Cleven, John Egan, and their comrades were commanded to line up by the front of the camp. They were only given 30 minutes to prepare for their march. The airmen scrounged up Red Cross rations they could shove into their pockets, covered themselves in what extra clothes they could, and stood at the ready in the frigid snow in the freezing dark. That winter, Europe was experiencing record-breaking, brutally cold weather. At first, Gale Cleven, among others, were unbothered, even cheery at this order, as they had assumed this meant they were going to be freed by the Americans any day now. Before heading out on the march, the Germans told the American prisoners they would be shot if they tried to escape. Only several hours later, American prisoners and German guards alike were collapsing in the snow from exhaustion and cold exposure, needing to be aided by others around them to keep moving. Not given any food or water, Americans had to scoop up dirty, sometimes soiled snow to remain hydrated. A couple Germans and several Americans died just a couple days into the march. Arriving at a pottery factory to rest one night, the Americans encountered a group of prison laborers from Poland and France. Some of the women offered sex in exchange for supplies like soap and chocolate bars, although most of the airmen declined, choosing instead to collapse onto the concrete floors of the building, desperate for any reprieve from the exhausting march they could get. After leaving the factory, the airmen passed a village, seeing something unforgettable. The nearly 30-mile-long line of soldiers now began to crowd in with an even longer stream of refugees filling the roads. There were close to 7 million people stretching across the area that 1 week alone who were fleeing the Russians. The airmen passed by gaunt horses pulling wagons with cold children huddled inside. They occasionally saw beat-up German soldiers with fearful expressions and shockingly young faces, sometimes asking the Americans for food. After 6 days of marching, finally reaching their destination of Spremberg, the Americans were finally given rations of black bread and barley gruel from the Germans. Shortly afterwards, they were packed into unmarked, closed cattle cars to be transported. Noticing this, the airmen were fearful this would mean they might be unknowingly targeted by American planes. Berlin, February 3rd, 1945. By the start of February 1945, Rosie Rosenthal had now flown 51 missions. On February 3rd, he was getting ready to fly one more. This time, Rosie was flying as a co-pilot, and the target was Berlin. Earlier in the war, the American military had symbolically declared it would avoid indiscriminately bombing civilians during the war in Europe. Despite this, many of the bombings the 100th had carried out that targeted industrial areas in Germany up to this point had led to many civilian deaths. The difference on February 3rd was that civilians would be an openly stated target. On Rosie's approach to Berlin, the sky began to fill with columns of smoke rising 7,000 feet into the air from the city below. The lack of visibility caused Rosie's division to miss their primary target and bomb a residential area below. As the bomb drop was starting to take place, flak exploded into Rosie's plane. One of the engines caught fire and the plane began to fill with smoke. 2 of Rosie's crewmen were killed. Panicked, the man next to Rosie turned to him expectantly. The cockpit was now starting to fill with smoke. In response, Rosie just silently signaled ahead in front of them. After it had dropped its bombs, Rosie's plane began making its way into Soviet territory in order to bail out and evade capture. After contacting his division, Rosie hit the alarm to signal his crew to evacuate. And suddenly, a massive inferno engulfed the middle of the aircraft. The plane began to fall out of the sky. The B-17 was now on a collision course with the ground thousands of feet below. The last living man left in the plane, Rosie was fighting against the physics of the diving plane, hardly able to budge as the B-17 rapidly lost more and more altitude while spinning out. Quote, "I could barely move. It felt like I was in quicksand, but I somehow managed to reach the open hatch and squeeze through just before the plane blew up." The airmen and other planes looked on as the flying fortress exploded, all of a sudden vanishing from view. Rosie's friends would be flying back to Thorpe Abbotts without him on that day. Still in the sky, however, were 6 chutes from that plane, and hanging from one of them was Rosie Rosenthal. But jumping out only a couple thousand feet from the ground, Rosie was speeding towards the land beneath him. Crashing into the ground, his arm broke yet again. Rosie attempted to hide, but was spotted by several Russian soldiers that were prepared to subdue him as they had suspected he was a German. Clearing the air, Rosie tried his best to signify his identity, hollering, quote, "Amerikansky, Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin." Quickly changing their tune, one of the Russians started to smooch Rosie's cheeks, gripping him in a bear hug. The Russians escorted Rosie to a jeep. Meanwhile, Rosenthal's eyes were transfixed to the burning Berlin in the distance. Apocalyptic amounts of fire and smoke covered the city. Rosie Rosenthal would eventually arrive in Moscow, residing there for a short time. However, while there, he contacted Thorpe Abbotts, declaring he would soon return to keep fighting. Can you believe that this story even had a picture-perfect Coca-Cola ad in it? Ridiculous! Actually, it becomes significantly less picture-perfect when we talk about what was happening beneath planes like Rosie's. Below, 1945. Allied bombing raids resulted in hundreds of thousands of cumulative civilian deaths in Germany. Under the bombings, many German cities, including Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and others, were devastated. All manner of German people were incinerated underneath the bombs. Nazi supporters and political dissidents alike. Allied bombers thundered over cities, dropping thousands of pounds of explosives. Fires tore through factories and neighborhoods. Children and the elderly scrambled and screamed like animals, burned alive or suffocated. Many buildings collapsed or were reduced to ashy rubble on the ground. Infrastructure was torn up, leaving civilians with little access to resources like water. Torturous ends of many people were delivered by payloads from Allied planes. For years, Germany was conducting civilian bombings of Britain, killing tens of thousands. The Wehrmacht had already engaged in many years of atrocity, destroying villages, raping, pillaging, enslaving, and exterminating. By the end of the war, the Germans killed over 11 million civilians. It was mass violence on a scale unlike any other conflict. And still, in February 1945, Germany had not yet surrendered. These were the consequences and stakes of a world war. Thank goodness that after World War II, everyone collectively decided never to engage in that type of warfare ever again. At the Plains Mercy, February 1945. After their train ride, Gale Cleven and John Egan were now residing in a filthy prison camp with no heat and no beds, called Stalag 13. This was a camp located close to Nuremberg. By the time the Americans hit the camp, they were completely beaten down and enraged, needing to be calmed by their higher-ranking officers so as not to instigate a response from the Germans. While there, they were right up next to the bombing raids conducted by the British. The bombs shook the ground where the prisoners stood. Anti-aircraft shrapnel fell out of the sky, leading the airmen to have to take cover in trenches. Weeks into their imprisonment, rations became very scarce. They were no longer receiving barley soup, but dried vegetables infested with bugs. By the 1st of April, the prisoners were weak and scrawny. At this point, the Germans had the airmen line up to be relocated again, this time towards Munich. During the march, their column was mistakenly targeted by some American Thunderbolt planes, killing several airmen. By creating a giant American Air Corps sign on the road, the airmen were able to stop subsequent attacks. Eventually, the starved Americans received parcels from the Red Cross, filling up on critically necessary high-calorie foods like chocolate and condensed milk. Escape. March 1945. Upon reaching the Danube River on their march to their new prison camp near Moosburg, Gale Cleven was ready to attempt an escape. He told his superior officer that he had suspicions the Germans were planning to use American airmen as bargaining tokens while holding out a potential final stand in Austria. Despite aligning with Gale Cleven, John Egan had responsibilities in the group of POWs that prevented him from being able to escape along with Cleven. Egan did, however, aid in his friend's escape. Late one night, Egan was able to twist and turn a loud creaky pump and distract the German guards while Cleven attempted his escape. Crawling down through an enclosure full of manure, Cleven and a couple other airmen successfully evaded the attention of the guards. Cleven recalls, quote, "It was Chanel number 5. It took the dogs off our scent. Once out of the stockade, we took off through the muddy fields and slept that evening in a grove of willows. We had no map, no compass, but we figured if we kept moving west and traveled by night, soon run into our boys." Gale Cleven and his 2 comrades fled the area. Cleven and one of his friends eventually made it into Allied territory, but the other had gotten separated and, unbeknownst to them at the time, had been shot by a German soldier. Mercy Run, 1945. By mid-March, Rosie Rosenthal had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was back in England, having recovered from the injuries he sustained after bailing out on the recent Berlin mission. By this time, the 100th no longer needed him for bombing missions. Rosie's combat tour was over. He had completed an astounding total of 52 missions. However, in April, he chose to fly once more on a rescue mission to transport French POWs out of Austria. The final day, April 29th, 1945. John Egan and his group of airmen had arrived at a new prison camp, Stalag 7A, located right by Moosburg. By the end of April, it had over 100,000 prisoners, ranging from POWs from many Allied countries, alongside prisoners from concentration camps and slave laborers. Suddenly, on the morning of April 29th, one day before Hitler's suicide, the camp became submerged in a firefight. German guards disappeared from their posts as the fighting intensified. John Egan, protecting himself in cover, heard the commotion of the battle taking place, the sound of heavy arms fire, even bullets zipping through the camp. Patton's Third Army had arrived and was battering the Germans around Moosburg. Eventually, John Egan was able to see the Americans raise their flag over the town. The Germans had lost. Upon realizing the Americans were victorious in the battle, the book states, quote, "Thousands of American prisoners, tears streaming down their cheeks, stood at attention, saluting the flag. Then, a Sherman tank smashed through the main gate, and the men rushed towards it, patting and kissing it, and holding out their hands to touch their emancipators as they popped out of their hatches. A number of POWs from various allied nations pulled out flags of their countries they had hidden well in the camp and flew them in the air. Prisoners from Russia, France, America, and many more all cheered louder than before. George Patton made his way through the camp, and upon seeing the emaciated American prisoners proclaimed, quote, 'I'm going to kill these sons of bitches for this.' After trucks of rations arrived in the camp, John Egan's commanding officer informed the airmen they would be flown to France in a week or so. That night, Americans raided Moosburg stores for alcohol and other goodies, celebrating together. That part of the book definitely left me wondering, though. Who got to take the Sherman tank home that night? Victory in Europe, May 8th, 1945. On leaving London, Rosie Rosenthal was wandering around on the afternoon of May 8th, at the moment that everyone learned of the official victory in Europe. A mass celebration broke out, with drinking, flirting, and joyful chaos. By the end of the war, Gale Cleven had already returned to Thorpe Abbotts, soaking up the admiration from many members of the 100th. On VE Day, no longer able to fight, he decided to head home. Before he left, surviving crew members from his old squadron gifted him a watch and a silver set. Overcome with emotion, Gale Cleven began to cry. After the war, Gale Cleven and John Egan had both returned to America. Cleven quickly married his sweetheart, Marge, in Hobbs, New Mexico, with John Egan as his best man. Rosie Rosenthal also returned to America, but was undergoing B-29 training in Florida. He wasn't ready to end his fight yet. This guy literally could not be stopped. But it wasn't long before the Japanese surrendered, leading Rosie to finally return to his old life in New York City. However, he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, like he hadn't quite gotten closure on his service during the war. Learning of the Nuremberg trials, Rosie decided to take a ship over to England to join the legal staff. On his trip overseas, he met an American woman named Phyllis Heller, who was also a lawyer that would be on the legal staff at Nuremberg. They quickly fell in love, eventually getting married in September 1946. Rosie remembers a story while living in Nuremberg, a city that had been completely decimated by Allied bombing. Broken down buildings, destitute people. Quote, "The bombing had ruined the people as well as the city. They were in desperate straits that winter. Women's clothes were unkempt, old men were unshaven, and there were hardly any young people to be seen. Families didn't have enough food, and there was no economy, only a thriving black market. One evening, Phyllis and I were walking alone by the river, and we sensed that someone was following us. When we stopped, he stopped. Phyllis was smoking a cigarette, and when she tossed it in the gutter, this man rushed up, picked it up, and disappeared into the shadows. Cigarettes, even butts, were valuable items on the black market, and we assumed he planned to trade it. That's what the people of the 1,000-year Reich had been reduced to. You have to feel sorry for them. Yet, I refuse to believe the German people were not responsible for Hitler, especially here in Nuremberg, the city where the Nazis held Roman-like rallies and where adoring women had thrown flowers on Hitler's motorcade. There was no need for a campaign of retribution against these ordinary people who had supported Hitler. They had suffered enough. Let them live with what they had done, and what had been done to them. That would be punishment enough. But the Nazi leaders and their criminal henchmen had to be treated differently." Rosie went on to investigate the crimes of leading Nazis Göring, Jodl, and Keitel. He interrogated all of them. Quote, "Seeing these stuttering conquerors after they were sentenced, powerless, pathetic, and preparing for the hangman, was the closure I needed. Justice had overtaken evil. My war was over." At least in my opinion, without ever stating it outright, Masters of the Air definitely illustrates how much war sucks and how we should probably stop doing it. Beyond the first-hand accounts like Cleven's or Rosenthal's, the book details a lot of disturbing high-level military decisions that cynically led to far more American or civilian deaths. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you're curious about the scope of the European Air War itself. The book also contains a lot more stories of different airmen and the tribulations and horrors they faced. There are so many stories woven throughout the book. It's very impressive.